My name is Lance Ralston, and I am a content provider and pastor at large with Enduring Word. I recently retired as the lead pastor of a church in Southern California for 42 years. Several times over those years, I thought it would be great. There was a resource available on inviting and hosting guest ministers, pastors, preachers, worship leaders, musicians, all the special guests that a church or a ministry might invite. Both churches and guests have specific needs. Sadly, sometimes those aren't communicated to each other. As a host of guest speakers, I think we did a pretty good job of making sure that they had all of their needs taken care of. But on the other side of it, as a guest speaker, I've seen both excellent and let's just call it not so great hosting. So I thought it would be a good idea to put together a resource for both churches and for guest ministers. In the description below, you're going to find links to printed materials to use alongside the information that I'm about to share here. You can print it out and use them as checklists. For churches and ministries inviting a guest speaker, maybe the most important thing that I can say is this: anticipate. Anticipate the needs and questions of a guest. You can do that by asking yourself what you would need to know if you were walking into and speaking at another church or event. Now, in your invitation, consider these points. Be clear what date and time you're inviting someone. What is it that you're asking them to do? Is it a sermon? Are they speaking at a conference, multiple times at a retreat? Are they leading worship for a service? What exactly do you want them to do? If you're asking a speaker, what subject, passage, or theme is it that you want them to cover? Now, I realize sometimes churches just want a person to come and teach on whatever the guest wants to, and that's fine. But be clear, that's what you're asking them to do. Once you share what it is that you want them to speak on, don't change it. One of the frustrations that I've heard from guest speakers is how they're asked to speak on something, but then a week before the event, they're asked to speak on something else. Once you tell a guest to speak on something, stick with it. They've spent time preparing for that, and they may not have time to prepare for a new message. That would be especially disastrous if it was a retreat where they were doing multiple messages. Another thing to avoid is telling multiple guests to speak on the same theme, but then leaving it to them to pick specifically what they're going to speak on. It's a nightmare when you prepared a great message and someone before you uses your text and, in essence, preaches your message. If there are going to be multiple speakers, assign them specific topics and/or passages. It's also wise to let them know what the other speakers will be speaking on so they have a heads up on what passages to steer clear of as they prepare. All right, let's talk now about travel. If the person is local, that's easy. But really the question is, what's local? If they have to travel more than, let's say, an hour and a half from their origination to the venue where they're going to speak, that's really not local. It might be wiser to have them arrive the night before if they're speaking in the morning so that they can stay closer to where they will be. Talk to them about it because they may prefer to drive in on the day of the event if it's an afternoon or evening. If they have to travel, you're going to need to work out the details. Will they drive or do they need to fly? If they drive, consider the distance and the cost for gas. If they fly, it can be a little bit more complicated. Generally speaking, it's best to let the guest make arrangements and then reimburse them. And this is where it can get complicated. So let me just spell it out. A person of integrity is most likely going to book airfare at the economy or economy plus level. But if the guest does a lot of travel or is an older person, they may need to upgrade, especially if the flight is several hours. They may use miles to upgrade, but the host ought to reimburse for the flight at the regular economy plus level. One of the things I've seen recently on flights is how every seat has an upcharge on the basic fare. Now, I don't understand that, and it's super frustrating, but it is what it is. The inviting church may want or prefer to book flights so that they can, get credit for the miles, or maybe use miles for the flight, and I understand that. But that makes it really rough for a guest because now they have to arrange their entire schedule around something that someone else made for them rather than something they knew would fit their schedule. Guest speakers have a life and commitments of their own. They're not sitting around waiting to go to the next event. So it really is best to let them make the flight arrangements and reimburse them. Yeah, you can ask them to give you a heads up on what the cost will be before they book. That way there are no surprises. And then think about transportation once the guest arrives. Will they rent a car or will they be picked up by someone? Who will pick them up and where? Be sure phone numbers have been exchanged and the guest has a backup number in case the driver is delayed for some reason. Prior to the event, tell the guest how long to speak and what the order of service is. You're going to go back over a lot of this with them on the day of the event, but it's good to know ahead of time what the plan for the day is. Who will the guest be speaking to? And what I mean is, what's the audience? How many people are likely to be there? What's the space that the event is going to be held in? Is it a church service in a church? Is it a retreat at a conference center? What's the weather likely to be so they know what to pack? What's the dress code? Now, I realize that may seem like an odd element to include, but speaking from the perspective of being a guest speaker, really isn't. Where I live in Southern California, most events are casual. But there are areas of the country where the pulpit requires a dress shirt and tie. Some countries of the world would be scandalized by a speaker in a church not wearing a suit or a sport coat. So it's a good idea to know what's expected. The speaker may end up alienating his audience before he's even opened his mouth. As the host, think about what the guest may need at the event in terms of media. Does the guest need or want a title slide or graphics? Will they be using PowerPoint, Keynote? Or does the ministry have a presentation program like ProPresenter? If so, will they control it or do they want the host church or the ministry to? If they want the host to advance the slides, is there a copy of the message with keyed points telling when to advance the slides? Does the guest have materials that they want to make available to people before and after? If so, make arrangements to provide a table and someone to staff it, unless the guest is bringing someone to handle all of that. Now, at the event, when do you want the guest to arrive? Where should they check in? Who's going to greet them? Has that person been informed? I realize that seems really obvious, but it happens that it just gets miscommunicated. Has the sound team been prepared with the need for a microphone and a sound check? Explain the layout of the facility to the guest. Be sure they know where the restroom is. Show them where they should sit during the service. Help them place their teaching tools, their Bible and their notes where they need to be so that when it's time for them to speak, they're ready and they don't need to start setting their things up. Rehearse the order of service. That is, go over with them so they know when it's their time to do their thing. Now, this is important and something that too often gets overlooked. Be especially clear on when the guest is to take their place and teach. Will someone introduce them? Or should they just follow right after the announcements or the worship time? And then, how do you want them to conclude? Do they pray and dismiss people or turn the service over to someone else? It's awkward as a guest when you don't know what's expected of you. As the host, it's your responsibility to, never let your guest feel awkward because you neglected to inform them or do something in preparation for them. As I mentioned, there are links to additional information in the description below this. Remember, as the recently departed Gail Irwin used to say, the job of a servant is to make the lives of others better. And as you know, Jesus said that the greatest in his kingdom was to be a servant. So be a servant to those that you invite as guests so that they can better serve the people of your church or your ministry. Okay, now let's talk honorarium. Many times over the years, I've been asked by young pastors what an appropriate honorarium is for an event. It's a difficult question to answer because, we seem to have competing guidance from Scripture. Note I said seem. It turns out there is no confusion in the Bible about this. Jesus made it clear, freely you have received, freely give. Servants of Christ ought to be ready to serve without regard what they're going to get from it. And while that ought to be the motivation of those who minister, it also ought not be used by those being ministered to as justification for taking advantage of someone. That's where other passages inform us, like Luke 10:7. and 1 Timothy 5:18, which both say that the labor is worthy of his wages. More to the point, I think, for our discussion here is 1 Corinthians 9:14, which says, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And Galatians 6:6, let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. An honorarium isn't payment just for the moment of speaking at a service or event. It's compensation for all that goes into that moment. Think of the hours of study and preparation and travel. An illustration. Pastor Mark's been asked to do a men's retreat for a group of churches. He's been told that he's going to speak 4 times for 45 minutes each time. Each message takes him 8 hours to prepare. That's 32 hours of study and preparation. Travel is 6 hours each way, and to save the cost of airfare to the churches involved, he's decided to drive. So that's 12 hours of travel there and back. Though he's only teaching for a total of 3 hours, he's at the retreat the entire time, ministering to guys between sessions. So Friday, he drives 6 hours and spends another 9 there Friday evening, then 24 hours all day Saturday into Sunday morning. Then he drives home another 6 hours. The total time that Pastor Mark invests in that men's retreat is give or take 77 hours. That's almost 2 weeks worth of the usual 40-hour work week. The leader of the retreat hands him an honorarium check for $600 because he assumes a decent honorarium for each of the 4 45-minute sessions is $150, and Mark's done 4 sessions. I hope you can see that $600 for all that Mark has invested simply isn't appropriate. Frankly, from his perspective, it's not good stewardship of his time and energy. Hey, I've been on the other end of this, the host of men's retreats, and I know how tight the budget can be. So let me just give a dose of reality here. If you don't have the budget to give a real working wage to a guest speaker, whatever the service or event, you can't afford a guest speaker. By the way, $150 for a service or a session, that's a standard we used to use back in the 90s. So forget that. Let's talk about the small church where the only staff member is the pastor. Now, he needs to take a break and asks someone to fill in when he takes a vacation. If one of the elders or members can't do it and a guest speaker is needed, you need to consider this. Think about it ahead of time, way ahead of time, about what it will take in terms of funding an honorarium. In other words, include the pastor's vacation in the budget by planning an honorarium for guest speakers to cover when the pastor isn't there. For churches and ministries with tight budgets, just be upfront with a guest and let them know how much you can do by way of an honorarium. It might not be much, but that person that you're inviting may sense the need to come anyway. The point is, just be upfront. Now, for guest speakers, you can take all of this that we've given to those that would invite you and use it as a template to gather the information that you need. If you find this information helpful, I would encourage you just send a link to this video to the church or the ministry that's invited you, ask them to take a look, and to use the documents listed below. You could print out a copy as well and use them as a checklist to make sure that you have all of the information that you need. Now, as I wrap this up, I remember that all of this, it's really just intended as a way to make sure that the service or the event a guest speaker has been invited to goes